Okay, welcome. We're glad to have you here. This is a 101 track talk. We're going to talk about network segmentation. It's going to be very simplistic, just to cover the basics of what network segmentation is and how it works. My name is Jeremy Cox, Super Tech Guy. I work for Washington County School District as their Network and Security Manager. My website you can find at www.supertechguy.com, where you can find this training, the slides for this training, along with every other training I've done and will do, and also my employer's website if you're interested. So why network segmentation? That is a great question. It is a very important question, and we're going to talk about what it is, why it's important, how it impacts us, and what it could mean when we have something that's not segmented or a super flat network. So to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a story about Joe. Now, Joe is your average network engineer. He got hired. He's on the job. He's not sure exactly how to put it together, but he knows enough that he's put this network together, and Joe runs a small business. And so this is Joe's traditional flat network. And on Joe's network, he's got about 6 workstations. He's got a web server. He has a file server. Joe says, you know what, we're going to buy a firewall. And so he bought a firewall, and he's got that hooked up to, and it's doing its routing. And then he's got wireless for a couple of tablets and phones and a laptop or two. Okay? So this is Joe's network. It's very, very flat. And it has some very major problems. And we're going to illustrate how that could be a potential issue. So, as Joe always says, well, we've got a firewall, and that's going to be enough. That should protect us from all of the challenges that we've got. So Joe has all of his different things there. He's using WPA2 pre-share keys. He doesn't feel like he's big enough to use 802.1x, but he figures that pre-share key is plenty good. All right, so the problem is Joe just so happens to be running a nice copy on his web server that is just out of date. He's running some software that's out of date, and it gets hacked. So what does this mean for Joe? His web server gets hacked. Now we have a problem, right? But the file server just so happens to be using the exact same admin password, so they get the hashes off the web server, and then they're in the file server. Well, then, you know what? They place malware on the company file share, and guess what? Every single device is now hacked across the network. So flat networks can potentially cause issues just like this. And it just so happens to affect Joe's machine, which then infects, and they have access to his switches, his routers, his firewall, the whole game, and it's done. So what did Joe learn? Well, Joe learned some important lessons. First of all, what went wrong? First, he didn't have his software up to date. Okay, that was one of the key things. We know that, hey, if he had updated that web server and had the software up to date, he probably wouldn't have been hacked in the first place. Second, don't reuse admin passwords. Well, Joe learned that one the hard way too. And why does the web server need to talk to the file server? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. The web server and the file server shouldn't have to exchange files. And so sales comes in. Joe says, I got a problem. He talks to his value-added reseller, and they come in and they say, okay, tell you what, I've got this cool WAF. We're going to take this WAF, we're going to stick it there, and now if you accidentally have a vulnerability or a 0-day, you're set to go, man. So Joe puts this WAF in his network. And now, magically, the web server is now segmented off of the rest of the network. So, we have a little bit of segmentation. Now, I told you these were workstations, but let's tell you a little bit more detail about what they are. So, we've got payroll, we've got HR, we have Joe, and then we have a product support team. They're still sitting on that same network. Well, Joe goes through, and Sue in the product support team was browsing the internet and got a drive-by, and now she's infected. So Sue then uses a man-in-the-middle attack and infects a couple of more machines, including payroll. Wonderful. Nothing like social security numbers and bank account numbers and all the wonderful things that you can find on a payroll machine. So what did we learn from this attack? Well, this was an OS problem. Okay? It was beyond our control. She got, or a browser problem. It was a 0-day. We didn't know about it. Sue's machine was up to date. So, it's not our problem. Well, why can Sue's computer even see the payroll computer? Why does it need to? Is there a reason that Sue's computer needs to talk directly to the payroll computer? Well, that's a great question. So maybe we should separate product support from sensitive operations like payroll. So now we get some real segmentation going on here, okay? So Joe goes in, he says, okay, I'm going to create a couple of VLANs. We're going to split these out. We're going to terminate them right off the firewall. We're going to put some access lists to control what can talk from the product support team to sensitive operations, where Joe just so happens to live as well. And we end up with segmentation. And then Steve, who just so happens to work for payroll, brings in his compromised phone from home. Well, that's just great, Steve. You got infected off our network, and now you bring it in, and now you're infecting our payroll, our HR. It uses an O-Day for Windows 10 and 7, and uploads malware to the primary file share. Well, then it gets everybody else. We're done. Okay, game over again. And Joe, and finishes off the rest of the network. So segmentation is great sometimes. No, actually it's great all the time. What you need is a more complete plan. And so let's talk about the lessons learned. First of all, what went wrong? Well, why can a personal device talk to a payroll computer? Even if it is Steve who works in payroll. Is there a reason why Steve's phone that he has in his pocket should be able to talk directly to his machine sitting on the network? Is there any reason for that? I can't think of a reason. Yeah. So there's no good reason. But the primary and the primary share is the real problem. Well, do we have a share that we share out across our entire organization? There could be some legitimate issues with that. So maybe we should separate all wireless and maybe do some dynamic VLAN assignment in 802.1x. Yes, Joe, you're big enough for 802.1x. It's okay. We can live with that. And then we can isolate off some personal devices. We don't need to share, and we really don't need to share that everyone can access. All right. So Joe decides that Wi-Fi and network don't mix. That's awesome, Joe. Good job. All right. Now, all of his Wi-Fi is now segmented off, and there is a nice access list sitting on the firewall that says what it can and can't do and see. All right. So the next thing that happens is Rick from product support team was browsing, and you'd think that Rick would learn from Sue, but unfortunately, no, they're browsing on the internet, and suddenly they're infected. And then Rick's computer uses a Windows 10, 7, and 2016 O-Day, and suddenly now we've infected a bunch more things. And then the file server uses that same O-Day and infects a few more devices, which infects Joe again and finishes off the rest of the network. But wait, the wireless devices didn't get infected. Interesting, isn't it? Because they didn't have any access to anything. Wonderful, okay? So, but more importantly, nothing had access to them. So, lessons learned. Why does the file server need to talk directly to the workstations? Anybody can think of a reason why the file server might need to talk directly to the workstations? There are some cases with Active Directory, and you can research those, and you can open up those ports, but do you need all 65,000 ports opened up from your server network to your workstation network? Probably not, okay? So maybe we should restrict what comes out of even our server networks. Segmentation is all about control. It's all about saying, what do I have that could potentially go wrong, And where can I limit the extent of the damage that it could cause? And then you say, okay, what functions do I have? What is mission critical operations? What do I need to allow through? And the rest of it, does it need to be allowed through? Okay? It's all about control. Now, when we're dealing with fire control, this is a fire line. This is, while the fire is going on, we're trying to stop it. We're trying to create a buffer zone, correct? That it's not going to pass through. If we can create a control line that we can hold the fires back long enough that we can contain those fires in that area of our network, then it's a lot easier to deal with the problem when it arises. Not only that, but it limits the extent of the damage that it can cause. Because you may have networks that are, if somebody hacked that network, we'd survive. And then you have networks that, if someone hacked that network, we'd be dead. And you have to take those issues and decide what kind of access those networks need to each other. Because potentially, you've got a major problem if one of those networks that is, maybe we can let people browse the internet and do kind of what they want, and we have social security numbers and bank account numbers and all sorts of sensitive information over here. Now, how do we keep this over here section good and protected and clean from viruses and infections and potential compromise? See, the first thing that will happen when a hacker tries to get into your network is they will try to pivot. And they will try to use a point of control in your network to pivot into another portion of your network to gain more control, to gain more resources and more data. So this is all about control. Now, segmentation should be performed before the fire. Okay? We saw the picture. This is during the fire, before the fires. Now, they have this awesome, big, huge monster machine called a bullhogger. Okay? And if you've never seen one of these things operate, they are incredible. It's like an industrial shredder hooked onto an excavator. And literally, it just takes the machine and just munches it. And they create fire break zones using these types of devices. Segmentation needs to be as important and as you need to treat it just like this. You need to take your network and segment it before you have an issue so that when you do have an issue, you can control it. And it needs to be something that you sit down and really, truly think through. How is this going to impact? Because you've got to think about lots of different, this is mission critical. This has to work this way. It means you're going to have to do research. How does this protocol actually work? Does this protocol talk this way or that way? What ports does it use? What should I expect? It also means that when you start to put up these walls, you're going to have to be monitoring to watch. Okay, is traffic getting blocked? Is this traffic legitimate, normal traffic? If it is being blocked and it's legitimate, normal traffic, then how do we fix it so that it's not? How do we fix it so that it works? So the key goals are your containment of threats, your containment of damage, and the separation of data systems by sensitivity and by function. And then to implement a policy of least privilege so that people only have access what they need to have access to, and ultimately to slow down those attackers. Because when you have a flat network, it's like opening the firewall and letting them in. So these are hopefully the takeaways I hope you take from this. When building network segmentation, remember what happens on this network, what data is exchanged, how do you exchange that data, and who uses it. Okay? If it's dissimilar from other networks, should it be separated? So if you have payroll on one network and HR on another network, or do you put them on the same network? It's up to you. It really depends on how you want to plan out your security plan. How that looks to you is entirely up to you. And what access is required to perform those essential functions. Okay? Server networks don't need full access to client networks, And IT networks with total access to everything can be Pandora's box. A lot of times we think, as the IT guy, I need to have access to everything from my machine. And you don't necessarily need access to everything from your machine. Because if your machine gets compromised, game over, man. It's that simple. So think about some of those things. Key technologies, you're talking about VLANs, you're talking about software-defined networks, mostly in data centers, sometimes in not the data center, in the edge. You're talking about wireless networks, 802.1x, okay, dynamic VLAN assignment on 802.1x, and firewalls, or at a minimum between those networks, access control lists. So say you don't have a firewall you can put in between, fine. At least use some ACLs on your router to control access, because that is at minimum one of the most important things you can do. Okay, any questions? Man, you guys are quiet. No questions? Hey, I ended, okay, yeah, go for it.
What's the worst network segmentation issue
The worst network,
oh.
Well, I'm not at liberty to disclose a whole lot of details, but what I can say is when we've done pen tests in the past and found networks that were totally flat, and when I say flat, I mean the public network is sitting, the public wireless is sitting on the same network as one of their servers. It changes the entire landscape of the pen test. It makes everything so much easier. It's like by the time we're done, we own everything. And there's no barriers, no walls. It's like walking into a warehouse and going, here are all your files. Let me just take them. Okay? It's really that simple. Without segmentation, you're screwed. Okay? There was another question. Go for it. I agree, because you can segment to death, okay? Now, software-defined networks are really cool because they let you do the micro-segmentation and they make it really clean and easy. Okay, so his question is how do you make network segmentation manageable, okay? Because you really can make it can be turned into a monster very easily. So what you want to do is you want to take this and say, okay, what are our risk factors, okay? Where are our issues, and start to combine and work through this. It's not a process where you can just start saying, we're going to segment the whole flipping world off, but you want to start to group your sensitive data and that kind of information into different segments and do it in a way that makes sense for your organization. Because if you bite too much off right at first, and it may be a process that you kind of move through, but if you bite too much off at first, it can overwhelm you. Because there's a lot to do. When you segment out another network, you've got to deal with a lot of the issues, the flow issues in your network, and watch those. And if you do too much of that at once, it's a disaster. But the great thing about it is once you create these segments and you start to build it out, and you do it kind of in layers and roll it out in sections, it actually becomes easier after it's done. After you've got the kinks worked out, it just runs. And it runs really smoothly. But you've got to do a lot of planning up front. You don't want to do a half-done job. And ultimately, you don't want to do too much. But you've got to think about risk. Where's your sensitive data sitting? Where's the possible compromises? Think about that, kind of lay down your network and say, okay, this is where I have issues. And what if this happened? How do I deal with this? Now, say I've got a web server over here, and I have another web server over here. Now, if this web server gets compromised, the sensitivity of the data on this web server is about the same. Well, guess what? They can now sit on that same VLAN. Okay? So you have to kind of think through it that way, because otherwise you're right. It can be like segments of hell. Okay? It can be terrible.
So what is that kind of happy medium of that manageable, right? The manageable segment.
Where do you find the happy balance in the middle?
Technology, is the product, or some vendors you have. Anyways, I mean, I certainly understand the, Data 2.1x. Most people apply that in a wireless environment. You did mention software-defined networking. Can you expand on that a little bit of like, in that kind of that happy medium of like not quite zero trust and very much not a flat network, right?
So software-defined networking is very cool. And right now, there's only one company out there that does it on the edge, and I don't have any experience with it on the edge. And it's not real, I'm not sure that we're ready for the edge for software-defined networking. But in the data center, it's a real thing. And in the data center, you can get into microsegmentation in effect, say, you plug in a server, and even though it's on the same VLAN as this other server, guess what? You say exactly what it should be doing and what it should not be doing. And that's the cool thing about software-defined networking, is that that all happens right on the switch. That happens right at that port. And it identifies right on the port, hey, this server should not be sending out packets on this port. I'm going to block it. And it's a done deal. Even if they're sitting on the exact same VLAN. Okay? So SDN is cool. It's expensive as heck. It's really not cheap. Do I run SDN? At the moment, no. Okay? Because I work for education. I don't have a lot of money.
Is there a platform for that or a vendor that has that?
Yeah, there's lots of them. In fact, most of the data centers the data center grade switches all have an SDN component. Okay. Yeah, they almost every single one. Well, every single one I've ever looked into has an SDN feature set. You just usually have to pay more money for it. You have to have controllers. You have to have lots of extra stuff. And so the licensing factor and all that stuff. But finding that balance in the middle, like you're talking about, that really depends on your network. So you kind of have to find that happy medium depending on what you're protecting. If you're protecting Department of Defense grade material, the happy medium is somewhere on the other side, right? But if you're defending something that's a little less sensitive, then you can kind of swing one way. But you don't want to be over here, and you really don't want to be over here. You've got to find what's right for your organization based on your risk factors. Okay.
You mentioned to be careful of having IT VLAN being able to access everything. What would you suggest are some alternatives to someone that wants to avoid that? Would it be jump boxes or other privileged access workstations or what?
That's a great question. Jump boxes are a great option. In fact, there was a presentation done here at SAINTCON, when was it? 6, 7 years ago? I can't remember. A long time ago. They talked about different layers. And so in order to access one layer, you had to go up the chain of layers. And I'm not saying you have to necessarily do that, but you don't necessarily want a machine that you're browsing the internet on to have full access to the world. It'd be better to have a machine that's sitting somewhere else that you have to access and then get into access to other devices. So a jump box would be a good option. But you kind of want to work through that in your organization. How does that look? What does that mean? Personally, that's the way I do it. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for coming.